presentation today. First off, thanks everyone for jumping in on this presentation. This unique world we're in, a virtual world, literally. And I want to address actually doing the virtual interview online. And actually, there's a lot of components to the virtual interview that are very similar to an in-person interview. So we're going to kind of morph back and forth between the two, but really distinctly talk about how to be successful in the virtual interview. And there's different types of virtual interviews too, and we'll talk about those as well. The first thing I want to let you know is that we are recording this. So if at some point at a later date you had to jump off or you want to view the recording, that's totally fine. We will be recording this. Okay, let's get started. There we go. So let's just talk about the two distinct types of virtual interviews. The first one is actually becoming a lot more popular today. It's called the one-way video interview. And actually that's an interview format that has really started to take hold within the last year or two. And it's actually quite different than this live Zoom and virtual environment, where the one-way interview, what you basically do is you're not seeing anyone on the other end. What's actually happening is employer records the questions they want to ask you and gives you a distinct time frame to answer those questions. And you're not actually having that ability to actually connect with anyone online. So that makes it actually quite difficult. So the one-way interview is actually pretty interesting because this is that one opportunity where you really have to ramp up your level of enthusiasm and excitement in the way you answer your questions, because you're not going to get that other person on the other end to help kind of elicit those responses from you. So you got to really make sure you're really ramping that up. The good part of it is, since there isn't anyone on the other side, you can actually re-record your answer. So you can check your answer. If you like the answer, you can submit it. If you don't, you can actually re-record that. Now, typically the interviewer will only give you 1 or 2 times to do that, and they determine the time frame of your answer too. So they might only give you 30 seconds to actually complete your answer, but they might give you as much as 2 or 3 minutes. So the one-way interview does have some advantages. It gives you the ability to go back and check your answers and see how you like it, and then resubmit those. And again, the negative part is that you're not going to see somebody on the other end of that a computer screen, which does make it a little more difficult. One piece of advice also about the one-way interview is make sure that you really are, before you submit your answers, you're really checking the quality of your answer, because you can actually see it in text. You're actually going to be talking and sometimes even writing that answer out. So if you're writing the answer out before you submit that answer, make sure that you actually make sure you check for any errors, grammar, and that type of thing. That's really important. The live video interview, which is the second type of interviewing virtually, is what we see now. We're on Zoom, Skype, those type of software platforms. Obviously, in those situations, just like an in-person interview, you get that opportunity to connect with somebody on the other side. And we'll talk about that in terms of eye contact and how to make the most of that situation. But that's the second more common type of virtual interview. And actually 60% of first interviews now are virtual, at least in the first interviews stage. It's a lot cheaper for employers to actually conduct them virtually like this. It saves money in so many different ways. It actually saves you the travel, and it saves cost on that end as well. But 60% of interviews now in the first stages of the interview process are actually virtual. So that's actually jumped up dramatically. About 3 or 4 years ago, it used to only be about 30%, and 5 or 6 years ago, less than 10%. So we're seeing that change, and I expect that to probably be 70 or 80% in a couple of years. So they're definitely becoming more popular. So here's the most important thing. Before you actually jump online, whether it's a one-way interview or a virtual interview live, the most important thing is to prepare yourself ahead of time in testing your technology. Make sure that technology is, your microphone is strong. Make sure you have a good camera. If you're doing it with a laptop like I am, you have your built-in camera. But make sure everything is something you're familiar with. If you really haven't used, I mean, obviously we've used Zoom a lot in this new world we're in, so you're probably comfortable with that. But if there's another type of software that the employer is using, recruitment software, make sure you understand that well. That's important. And really test it ahead of time. And I always tell people, don't test it the day of. Test it 2 or 3 days prior to the interview. What I would actually do if it's a Zoom presentation is set that up with some family member or a friend. You could even do that with someone like me in career services if you want to practice ahead of time. I really encourage you to do that, because going into that first step of it, if you know your technology is strong, you have a good camera, your microphone's strong. You're really going to be set up in that way. You're going to feel a lot more confident stepping into that interview. And also, when the practice part of it too is not only checking the technology part, but the practice the actual questions. Really go through kind of a mock interview scenario with family, friends, or again, someone like me or someone in career services. That practice is going to be the key to really giving you confidence. I mean, there's the most important part of an interview, in person, live, or online, is just exhibiting confidence. You know, and the biggest function of confidence is preparation. So if you know everything's in line, your technology is strong, that you've truly prepared yourself, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about how to really prepare yourself ahead of time. That's how you're going to be the most confident. That's going to be exhibited on the screen. And the other thing about your environment and technology is secure a quiet place with no distractions. That's really important. People always tell you that with a phone interview, it's the same kind of concept. Make sure you're not going to have distractions. But this is additionally ramped up in a virtual interview because now your surroundings are particularly important. So obviously, you know, if you're comfortable sitting in your bed, don't do that. I mean, if you have a dirty bedroom, don't do it in that type of environment. Go into a place where it's going to be nice and clean and neat. And especially the area around you that they can see. Like, you can see me right now. I have a picture behind me. I have a lamp behind me. I would even avoid that. I would try to set yourself up where you have a blank wall, you know, because you want to be the center of attention. You're the primary focus. You know, you don't want the employer looking at your pictures or different things like that. You want to be the primary focus. So make sure that your environment is clean and neat. And on top of that, when you're in that, if you set up a professional environment around you, again, it's just one of those other little pieces that really just keep your confidence strong. You feel like you're in a good environment and nothing can, you know, throw you off. So secure a quiet place. Turn your cell phone off. Make sure that that's not going to ring throughout. That's obviously important. Also, lighting is important. You know, I'm actually in a kind of a darkish room. It's cloudy outside. I actually have my drapes drawn. So I would say, like, this is probably still on the cusp of a little too dark. So I would make sure open your drapes, sit close to a window. If for some reason it's in the evening and it's dark out, make sure you have lighting around you that's going to light up that area around you. That's important. Your facial expressions are incredibly important in this live virtual environment. So they really need to see your face well, your facial expressions, and lighting is a key to that. So make sure that you really light the area well, make sure it's clean, and make sure there's no distractions. If you have a dog, Tina, who's on this presentation, she's the career services person at the Schuylkill campus. Her dog yesterday came into the room and started snoring right next to her. So she had to literally walk around the room. So literally, if that happened to you, that's an uncomfortable moment. You know, if your dog comes in, they're distracting you or some kind of distraction, you never want to actually have to pick something up and move. Because what it's just going to do is it's going to throw you off. It's kind of the same concept of driving to an interview, being there 10 to 15 minutes early, and now there's a traffic jam and you know you're going to be late. That's a really uncomfortable phone call to make. So things that can distract you can really throw you off. And that's why, again, having technology in place, making sure it's working well, their environment around you is strong, that's really important, okay? Let's see here. In-depth preparation. So we talked about how do you really prepare for any interview. Preparation is the key. Like I said, it's really a function of building your confidence. Outside of being prepared to talk in the interview and answer questions effectively, know a lot about the organization, this preparation process really helps build your confidence. So here are a few steps to really position yourself to be confident and do well in the interview. The first thing is research the organization to the highest possible level that you can. And when I say highest possible level, I mean highest possible level. And here's what it really is. Most times people will just go on and Google the company and read about them, look at their website and get some general information about them. And that's a good start, but that's not enough. What you want to do is research them at a high level. So what I would say is if you see their front-facing webpage, go on to that, learn as much as you can. But I would actually, if you are going to work in a department in that company potentially where you're interviewing, make sure you go to that department webpage. Read that webpage really well. Learn as much about that individual department as you can, coupled with knowing about the company. Because think about this. You're going to have to convince that organization that you're a cultural fit, that you fit with them, you know, and your enthusiasm on screen, your ability to convince them that you are part of that is a function of how much do you know about us? Because the more you know about them, it complements that environment. So they feel complimented the more you know, because it makes them feel like you're more interested in working for them. So research the main webpage, dig deep into the webpage. I mean, you can actually find things like, you'll see a lot of companies that say things like meet the staff. You know, so if you have the staff for that department you're potentially going to work in, and they might have little biographies about themselves, about their personal life or things that they like to do. Learn all of that information. You never know if small talk occurs somehow during the interview and you've actually learned that additional information, great value there. So really dig into it. Additionally, besides just the webpage, I would Google that company too and find out if they've been in the news at all. Have they developed any new type of thing that's going out into the marketplace? You know, learn about those products. Because here's the other side of it too, especially if you're going to be tied to a department that's in charge of that, you can think creatively during the process of the interview. How would I sell myself in this regard? They're just creating this new product line. I'm going to be responsible for being part of that. What good ideas could I come up with to show them that you know, I'm a forward thinker and I can be part of this new organization, this new product that they're developing. So dig that far. Additionally, if you know any people that have worked at that company, even if you know a student, if you're a student and you know a student that interned there, pick their brain, you know, pick their brain about the interview process itself, you know, what they did during the course of their internship. So this high level of research, you're getting the sense of what I'm saying. It's not a 5-minute thing. It's a couple hour thing, you know, if you research effectively. If you go to career services, if you're a student, check in with someone like me and say, John, do you know any alumni that work there or work in this field where they just can give me some additional knowledge? And if you can get that type of thing, because I can tell you right now, they're going to ask you sometime during the course of the interview, and usually it's quickly. They're going to say, you know, tell us what you know about us. What do you know about our organization? I mean, if you can spout off all these different things and share with them how much you've researched them, trust me when I tell you, that's an impact start to the interview. So make sure you try to do that. An additional thing, find or ask for a job description. You know, a lot of times and a job description isn't what the job ad was, you know, online. Because what they'll have is you'll have a job ad online that will explain the main functions of the position, the qualifications they're looking for. That's not a job description. That gives you kind of an intimate idea of the position itself. But you want to go a step further. What I would do is I would contact human resources ahead of time, and I would actually ask them to see if they can send you an actual job description for the position. Many times they will have that and they will do it. And trust me when I tell you, having that job description ahead of time is incredibly valuable. And here's how it's valuable. Because when you look at that job description, as you're thinking about your strengths and the qualities you bring to the table and how you might talk about those qualities and strengths, when you see that job description, there's going to be a lot of things on that job description, because it's going to be much more thorough than the job ad, that you're going to actually be able to look at and really pinpoint some key strengths and qualities you're going to be able to share based on those responsibilities. Because think about what a job description is. The job description is the position you're applying for. So the more you know about it, having that ahead of time, incredibly important. And to really, again, do that most important thing, build that confidence. Because now you know going in, my gosh, they can ask me pretty much any question about the responsibilities of this given position. And I'm confident I can share some example, some story, or some kind of strength that will add value and show them that I'm capable of doing the job. So find or ask for a job description ahead of time, and they'll send that to you. Prepare your skill set worksheet. So what does this mean? This is all part of that preparation process. Here's what I tell students to do. You know, and the beautiful thing about this is the information is so readily available. And here's what the information is. If you Googled, you know, characteristics that employers value, you know, qualities or characteristics that they value, you know, you're going to see a big list of things. There's going to be soft skills, communication skills, problem-solving skills. You're going to see lists of all these key components that are highly valued by employers. Here's what I want you to do. And this is that preparing that skill set worksheet. Print one of those off and actually go down that list. And next to each one of those qualities, whether it's problem-solving skills or communication skills, actually try to write an example next to each one of those things, or at least as many of them as you can. And it's going to help you build your example basket of examples that you're going to be able to bring to that interview, that virtual interview or in-person interview. And this part's important because here's where we get tripped up early, especially early in our interviewing lives. We're not really truly prepared to answer questions in a real thorough way. And I'm going to talk about a 3-step process in answering questions effectively. I'll share with you how to really do it well. But preparing that skill set worksheet, looking at all the qualities that employers value and thinking of examples that actually support that quality. Trust me when I tell you, this is going to be incredibly valuable, and it's going to be information that's going to really serve you well when you go in. And like I said, I'll teach you how to do that in the 3-step process of answering questions, but really take the time ahead of time to prepare that, because it'll be important. And as you're preparing that skill set worksheet, really understanding your strengths, your weaknesses, examples and stories. I'm a big storyteller. I'm a big fan of telling a story that illustrates a point. Not everyone's like that, but you can still think of your background and experience that illustrate points. And sometimes they can actually be stories, or just examples. You could say, in my internship experience, I was responsible for this. And it's interesting that this actually happened and I really learned something, sharing stories, sharing these examples, but think about them ahead of time. You're not going to know every single question ahead of time, obviously, but you can really prepare for the type of questions. And I'll actually talk about that, the type of questions you're going to get during the interview, but really know your strengths, your examples, and your stories that you're going to bring to the table. And as for the weaknesses, because I do put weaknesses in there, really know how to talk about those. One of the most uncomfortable parts of an interview is actually sharing your weaknesses. And actually, it's one of the questions that you get in. It's considered a stress question. I'll talk to you in a minute about how to talk about your weaknesses, but be prepared to do that. Employers want to see that you have the ability to talk about something uncomfortable about yourself in an environment like that. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. So, all right, the preparation process has begun. And you can see that when I just talked about that, I was adamant about how important that is. Because keep in mind, the preparation, if done well, builds your confidence extraordinarily high. And that's really important going in. So when you're ready to do your first virtual interview, interestingly, in a real live interview where you're actually physically going to a place of employment, the typical time to arrive is like 10 to 15 minutes early. Not so online. What you really want to do is arrive 1 or 2 minutes early, and 2 minutes at the most. They're not going to expect you to be there 10 or 15 minutes early, and they really kind of don't want you to be. And here's the reason why. If it's a one-on-one situation where you're going to be interviewing with just one employer live, it's totally appropriate just to come into that 1 or 2 minute window right before the interview starts, because in their mind, you are early and on time. If it's going to be an interview committee where there's 5 or 6 or 7 people, here's what happens if you go in 10 or 15 minutes early. If the room is open and you're able to go in and you only see 2 of those 6 or 7 people, they're going to feel like they have to, do small talk with you. And then you're going to have to be a good small talker. Don't put yourself in that position. You want to make sure that your first impressions are really with the whole collective group. So if you go in 1 to 2 minutes early, what's typically happening is, it's really close to the beginning of the interview, and the employer is actually going to probably start saying things like, hey, John, thanks for coming online. We're just taking the last minute to get ready. And then it puts you in a position where you don't have to say anything or do anything, or they might just get started a minute or 2 early. So you don't want to have to do much way ahead of time. You want the interview to begin and your first impressions to be, right when the interview starts. So let's talk about these first impressions. And interestingly, you probably have heard the phrase, you only have one chance to make a good first impression, and that's true. But actually, in an interview process, virtually and live, there's multiple first impressions. In a live interview, usually 3 first impressions occur. Think about this. When you first arrive at a place 10 to 15 minutes early in a live interview, you're actually going to be greeted by somebody, a secretary, a receptionist, typically not somebody that's on the interview committee at that point. And then you have that 10 or 15 minute window prior to the interview to kind of impress and do what you have to do. Then the second first impression in a live interview happens when the person who's going to interview you physically comes and gets you. And then you have that good handshake and that impression with them. Then they take you into a room, and if there's an actual interview committee, now you have a third first impression with all those people in the interview room. So that's a lot different than the virtual impressions, because what the virtual impressions are is really, as soon as that screen comes up and your face pops up on that screen, that's the first impression. And this one's visual. Remember what I said earlier, make sure if you can have a background that is a plain blank wall. You're the focal point. A clean environment around you so they can't see anything that's going to disturb them, in terms of a messy environment. So that clean virtual environment is important. That's kind of like that first impression. And the second first impression in the virtual environment, it really is just, it goes on to the next point, my virtual handshake. What is a virtual handshake? You know what a virtual handshake is? It's either the first words out of your mouth, because you don't have the ability to actually shake their hand in person, or if there's an interview committee, you see multiple people on that screen, a nice wave, because usually only one person that's in charge of that interview committee is going to get started. And they might say something like, hey, John, thanks so much for coming today. You see other people that aren't talking, wave to them. Say, thanks, it's a pleasure to be here. Wave to them, because then they feel connected to you right away. And that's kind of your second first impression in the virtual world. So that's kind of your virtual handshake. As the interview is about to begin, you really want to be a careful listener. And this part's important. And I say this to students all the time, especially when you're going into a live setting too. What happens a lot of times is when you go into a live setting, you sit down in front, physically in front of an interview committee a lot of times, or even just the person that's going to interview you. And now you think it's the first impression, right? But you've already had two of them and you don't even realize it. And what happens a lot of times is people get nervous. They feel like they have to say something interesting or maybe even slightly funny to kind of start things off. Don't do that. And don't do it in the virtual world either. Just be a careful listener. That handshake's enough, and let the interviewer take that first moment or two to explain the process. So you just be a quiet, active listener. That's really important in the first few minutes, because they're going to need to explain the process. They'll probably say something like, hey, we have the interview committee here online today. We're going to kind of just go around, each ask 3 questions, and they're going to talk for a few minutes. Just let them do it and be a careful listener. Okay. All right, taking notes. This is a really interesting topic, really in regards to the entire interview process, whether it's live or virtually. I say no, nope, don't take them. And the reason I do that is because think about this. If you've been on any interview before, which most of you have, the interview environment is such a heightened experience that by the time that interview ends, if you walk out of the room and somebody, like a friend, immediately said, how'd it go? What did they ask you? You always remember. It's such a heightened environment. You remember pretty much everything that goes on in there. And the reason I say it's not necessary to take notes or you actually shouldn't do it is because I'm a big believer in that eye contact, that body language is so important, especially in a virtual world, because like I'm looking at this directly at this camera now. That's all you have. I mean, that's all you have to connect. So make sure you're not taking notes, because what happens? Look at my eyes right now. I take my eyes off the screen and I write a note. Intuitively, that's the way we would write a note. So unless you're really savvy and you have a piece of paper and they say something important and you can just quickly write a note with not taking your eyes off the screen and just jot down something, okay. But that at the most. So I'm a big believer in not taking notes, because I think eye contact is critical, and especially in this virtual world. And that takes us to the next thing. Pay attention to your body language. Like right now, my body language is actually quite terrible. I'm leaning on the table. I have a hat on. I mean, I'm not even dressed appropriately. We will talk about dressing. But really, what I would say, if I was in a virtual interview, I would make sure that the camera really is right at my face. I would say probably because I have this up on the screen, my face is smaller. If I didn't have that on the screen, my face would be bigger, so I probably would be close enough. A good rule of thumb virtually is an arm's length from the computer. If you're arm's length, then that's the distance you need to be. But body language, you're sitting up straight. Pull your chair right up to the table so you can lay your back straight against the back of that chair. That's really important. That'll help your body language. But especially in terms of the eye contact, let's talk about this a little bit. Because I've already done this in the beginning of the interview. See me looking away, I'm looking away from the camera, I'm looking at myself talking. Make sure you don't do that. Avoid yourself on the screen and just look directly at the camera. Because think about it, that's the eye contact for the actual interviewers. And I have a little technique that's going to help you. And this is going to help you in a live interview environment and also online. It's called modeling the interviewer. And here's what it is. So it's harder to do online than it is in person, because in person what you do when you model the interviewer is when you're sitting in the actual interview room and you have all the people around the table or just the one person, what I always tell people to do is look straight at the person talking to you and actually kind of model their facial expressions back. If they're going to shake their head as they're explaining something, shake your head subtly with them. When they smile, a lot of that will intuitively happen. If they smile or say something funny, you're probably going to naturally smile back. It's a lot harder to do virtually, but the good news is they're going to be on the screen. Like I don't see you guys now, but you will see the employers. So again, if they smile or say something funny, you'll probably reciprocate that anyway. But the small little things that reciprocate their things. Now you don't want to mock them, you know what I mean? But you want to make sure you're responding to their facial expressions and you're giving that back to them. A recent being in the last year or two, employers were, there was an actual study out there that showed that I think it was just shy of 90% employers said that if eye contact wasn't strong throughout the interview, they never offered the person. And the 10% that did offer it, if the eye contact wasn't good, it was only because the skill level was so high or that person knew somebody else that helped them get the job. So almost in 100% of the cases, you're not going to get a job unless you have strong eye contact. So that's why don't take notes. Keep your eyes on the camera. And again, you know, when you have this, you know, 5 or 6 people on the screen, you know, you're looking directly at them, you're responding, but think in terms of the modeling the interview or model their facial expressions, and it'll help you have good eye contact, and it'll really make a big difference. All right, dress like it matters. You know, you probably hear this all the time, but you know, right now I'm in a t-shirt and shorts, you know, but if this was an actual real interview that I was going to be on, I would dress exactly like I did if I was going into an actual live interview. So even though you're not going to see anything below, you know, just my mid stomach, still wear dress pants, dress shoes, dress up. One, it'll just make you feel better. You know, there was a psychology review that showed that when you dress up totally in business attire, you just feel more professional. You know, so your whole presence is more professional. So that'll just make you feel better. And just in a rare scenario that if you did have to get up for some unusual reason, like your dog came in and snoring right next to you, and you had to physically get up for some reason, they can somehow see what you're wearing, it'll just impress them that you've done that. So make sure you wear, just dress exactly like you were gonna if you actually were in the interview. And also, just another note about dressing too is, and make sure everything they can see, you know, make sure it's ironed well, make sure everything's ironed well, that your tie is, if you're a guy, is tied really, you know, centered perfectly to the shirt. You know, I would say for females, you know, a blouse, but wear a blazer too, you know. Really make sure you're dressing the way you would if you were going to go into an actual interview environment. All right, so let's talk about the type of questions that you're actually going to get. The type of questions, there's a bunch of different types. The first is called open-ended questions. In fact, it's how almost every interview starts. And here's what an open-ended question is. An open-ended question is a question that sounds something like this. Elizabeth, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? The classic open-ended question. This is a tricky question, actually, believe it or not, because it's a personal sounding question. Tell us about yourself. But you want to really be careful about your approach to this answer. So you don't want to say something like, I was born in a small town in West Virginia. They don't care about that. What you want to do with the open-ended question is really stay relevant to the purpose of the day. So when they say, you know, Elizabeth, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? You'll start off something like, well, as you know, I'm a senior graduating from Penn State Scranton as an accounting major. You know, one of the reasons I was interested in applying to your company was, so you're still telling things about yourself, about your reasons and interest in the organization and company, but you're keeping it relevant to the purpose of the day. That really just keeps you on track. And really, it's giving them information they really, really care about. But I will say this, every once in a while, they will personalize the question further. And they might say something like, oh my gosh, I see that you live here. Or they might have seen something in your cover letter that might prompt them to say, you know, I see that you're, you know, were born in whatever town. Then you can start personalizing, but let them take you there, okay? So that's how you want to handle open-ended questions. Behavioral questions. Behavioral questions are the most common part of an interview. In fact, there's a whole style of interviewing called behavioral interviewing, and where the majority of the questions that you get during that situation are behavioral in nature. So let's talk about what a behavioral question sounds like. And I actually like to call them, behavioral sounds trickier. They're really scenario questions. And here's what a behavioral/scenario question sounds like. It starts off something like this. Have you ever been in a situation where, or what would you do if? So they're really trying to paint some type of scenario. And here's the thing about a behavioral scenario question. These sound very scary because what you're thinking is, oh my God, they're giving me a specific scenario that relates to their business. They clearly want a specific answer, but here's the good news. No, they don't. All you have to do with behavioral questions or scenario questions is this. It's a two-pronged approach. So when they ask you, what would you do in a situation, or have you ever been in a situation where you had to handle this situation? What do you do? They're looking for two things: good communication skills and the ability to problem solve on the spot. Okay, so let's take an example. Let's say you're a Penn State student, living in the dorms, living in housing on campus, which clearly isn't happening now, but, and they asked a question like this: have you ever been in a situation where, at the main campus, you were living in your apartment or on-campus residence, and you just didn't like your roommate? I mean, so much so that you didn't get along with them at all. It constantly caused problems. It affected your ability to, be effective in the classroom, even because it made life difficult. How'd you handle a situation like that? Or if you never had a situation like that, what would you do if you did? That would be like a behavioral scenario question. So remember the two-pronged approach: communication skills, problem-solving skills. Because what they want to see is that you have the ability to communicate your way through that issue. So you might say something like, I never had that situation, but if I did have that situation, what I think I would probably do is just sit my roommate down and really try to talk through what our problems were, and just say, look, we seem to clash a lot. Let's try to figure out a way to actually, improve this environment. So the first part is just communicating the issue at hand. And the problem solving part is just figuring out, how do we deal with this? How do we change the situation that we're in? And that might be something like, so what I probably would do is, I would make sure that, my roommate had 3 or 4 hours a day where they had the room totally to themselves, and I made sure that I went to the library or to the gym or did things and made sure I was away. And then they give me some time. So you're thinking about how to problem solve the issue to create a better scenario. And that's really what they're looking. And no matter what the situation, what the behavioral question is, what the scenario is, use that approach every time. Communication skills, and figure out a way to solve the problem, because that's what they're looking for right there in behavioral interviewing. So don't worry about the content as much as using that approach. And if you do that, that'll get you through every behavioral question. Stress questions. We talked a little bit about stress questions, and they come in a number of different formats. One of which is the weakness question. Actually, it's considered in the kind of stress question category. So let's talk about how you actually deal with a weakness question. First off, give one. And I can tell you right now, I've been on so many interview committees in my life where we've asked the stress question, and this was the answer. Hey, Bill, why don't you share, 1 or 2 weaknesses you think you have in regard to a position like this? And I've heard this answer so many times. Bill sits there, he contemplates, stress question, I mean, weakness. I just can't think of any. And I can tell you right now, if your answer is, I just can't think of any, you're pretty much not getting the job. And here's the reason why: because they want to know that you have the ability to deal with stress. I mean, stress happens in every single work environment. And this is a way to test that. Test your composure. And, so giving some type of weakness is really the first step. And there's actually three steps to handle the stress question. 1, give a weakness. The second thing is, not only give a weakness, but the second part is give a weakness that's not clearly damaging. I mean, if you're an education major and you're going for a teaching position, you wouldn't want to say, I just hate students. That's not going to serve you well, obviously. So, be intelligent about what you answer, what that weakness question, weakness answer is, making sure it's not totally and clearly damaging. And if you just chuckled at that, like, well, clearly I wouldn't say that, you'd be surprised how honest people think they need to be during this answer. Honesty and integrity in the interview process is incredibly important, but you're not being dishonest because you don't share some damaging weakness that you might really have. Just don't share it. It's not being dishonest. So make sure you're smart about how you share that. And the third step in the weakness process and talking about is show how you're currently trying to improve that weakness or what you've recently done to improve that weakness. And if you can use those 3 steps, give a weakness, one that's not clearly damaging, and what you've currently tried to do to improve it, I promise you, that'll be actually one of the really positive parts of the interview, because you will handle it so well. Yes, no factual questions. Yes, no factual questions are all also interesting because they're questions that are kind of designed to elicit a 1 or 2 word answer. So here would be an example. Let's say you're going for a position in college admissions, and a big part of the responsibility is to travel a lot. So they might say, hey, Bill, do you like to travel? And they might just leave it at that. Make sure you don't give a 1 or 2 word answer. And actually, I was on a recent interview committee where travel was a pretty big part of the process. And that was their question. How do you feel about travel? And the person said, I'm fine with it. And just stopped. You need to give more. So make sure in these yes, no factual questions, you give more. And here's how you give more. It leads us into how do I answer these questions? And that 3-step process that I talked about a little bit earlier. You know, and there's a lot of different methods on how do you answer questions effectively. You know, we have an incredible career guide that Penn State gives out to students. You know, we have an online version. If you want to email me after this, I can send you that online version. And in that that guide, it talks about, it's called the STAR method, which is actually 5 steps. That's a great method too. This is a more simplistic approach, but also incredibly effective and easier to remember. So that's why I talk about it in this way. So the 3 steps are what? 1, state what you want to prove. And here's the good news. You guys are already naturally good at that. Everyone's good at the first step. So the state what you want to prove might be something like, hey, John, why don't you share a few strengths you feel you bring to a position like this? So you might say, well, I'm highly motivated. I have excellent analytical skills, and I'm a team player. Let's just say those are your 3. So you're stating what you want to prove. Here's the problem. Especially early in our interviewing lives, people aren't great at getting to that key 2nd step. And the key 2nd step is to give examples to prove it. Because I can tell you right now, if you don't do a good job of giving examples to prove what you're stating, the chances of getting the job offer are dramatically lessened. I mean, dramatically. So you really have to give examples. And remember we talked about early in this interview about really preparing kind of your strengths and your weaknesses and all of your stories, going through that checklist, that worksheet where you're going to really think about your examples that tie to things. That's where that good work in preparation plays itself out during the course of the interview, because what you're going to do now is bring all those good stories and examples in, and you're going to be able to share, get to that 2nd step and give examples. And show why it's relevant. Show why it's relevant. So I'll give you an example of how to utilize the 3 steps, but let me just give one other example about the power of examples I actually given them. I was on an interview committee once where we interviewed a gentleman who did just a great job giving examples, but he was arrogant. He was definitely cocky and arrogant, but he did a wonderful job answering questions and giving really thorough examples. And I remember when that person walked out of the interview, our first gut reaction was, wow, he'd be tough to work with. He's cocky. And I remember we interviewed a female later in that day who was just as lovely as you could be. I mean, she was just wonderful. Such a sweet person, really, really likable, you know, and she went through the course of the interview, but she didn't do a great job of giving really credible examples. A lot of times we actually had to ask her, you know, can you tell us more about that? But she was just lovely, you know. Here's what happened at the end of that interview day. We talked about both of those candidates, and the person that we liked a lot, our first thought was, can she do the job? Somebody asked that on the interview committee. We're like, I don't know. And then we talked about the guy that we kind of hated, and our question was, can he do the job? And we're like, yeah. So think about that. The person that we actually didn't like, we were actually more strongly considering them, and we thought he'd be a pain to work with. The power of examples. It's really important, because you want to be the person that's liked and give the examples, because if you do that, then you become a credible candidate that's liked, and you increase your chance of getting the job much more significantly. So let me give you a quick answer that utilizes the 3 steps so you can hear how it sounds. John, why don't you, give us a couple strengths you feel you bring to the position? So I might say to start off, well, I think that I have really a strong background in communication. I'm really, really good at setting up large-scale job fairs. For example, in my previous position at Shippensburg University and my current position here at Penn State Scranton, I was responsible for setting up large-scale job fairs, one of which was a huge education job fair that took a lot of good organizational skills, and I might explain that a little bit in depth and why it might be relevant. The 3rd step would be, and I realize that that's particularly important for this position because based on the job description that you sent me ahead of time, I see that a big part of this position is going to be setting up large scale events. So I feel like I'm going to come into the position and just hit the ground running and have that background and experience right on the table. So that utilize the 3 steps. So the key is at least get to that example stage. And if you can wrap it up with the number 3, show its relevance, then you've answered the question very effectively. Coming toward the end of the interview, and you want to end the interview with impact. And there's actually ways to do it. You know, the first thing is, remember in that preparation stage, I didn't talk about it in preparing for the interview, but you want to have 7 to 10 questions prepared. And 7 to 10 questions sounds like a lot of questions to prepare, and it actually is a lot. you know, especially 7 to 10 really good ones. You know, here's the thing, you're not going to ask 7 to 10 questions, but here's why you want to prepare that many actually. The reason you want to prepare 7 to 10 questions is because during the course of an interview, they're going to answer some of the questions you've had that you prepared. They're going to naturally answer some of those. So if you only prepare 2 or 3, they might naturally answer them. And at the end of the day, I can promise you this, every single interviewer in the United States that conducts an interview will always ask you this at the end of the interview. Do you have any questions for us? 100% of the time. So here's the thing. You prepare 2 to 3 and they've already naturally answered them. Uh-oh. Because here's what you're going to do. You're either going to have to be really good about thinking on the spot and coming up with something, or you're going to say this, and I've heard this many times. You've answered all my questions. I can't think of any. That's not good. It shows your complete lack of interest in the position and really your inability to think on your feet. You know, so make sure you have those 7 to 10 questions, because if you do, you know they're not going to answer all of them naturally through the course of the interview, and then you'll have a few that you can ask at the end. There's really no right or wrong amount to ask. You know, I usually say 3 or 4 is a pretty nice number, but just have those prepared ahead of time. And you can actually prepare them. I mean, in a situation like this where it's virtual, you know, you can have the sheet right in front of you, and you can actually say, you know, I prepared some questions, and you can read right off the sheet. That would be totally appropriate. In an actual live interview, you could pull that sheet right out of your padfolio and say, I did prepare some questions, and they're totally fine with you looking right on the sheet and asking them. Never ask this question. Never ask about salary or benefits, ever. You know, there's some research out there that really kind of shows that when you get to that second interview or third interview in particular, if it's a 3-interview process, that you kind of earned the right to ask about salary or benefits. I'm just one person that's in major disagreement with that. Clearly, we want to know what the pay is going to be. I mean, that's an important, you know, tool in helping us decide if we're going to accept a position. But honestly, just never go there, you know, because the message you want to bring across as an interviewer is, you know, I'm so interested in this job, I'd practically do it for free if I had to. Now, clearly, you're not going to do that, but you want to give that impression that the money is not the most important thing. And they know money is important, and they'll cover it when it's necessary. So I would say just don't bring it up. That being said, be prepared to talk about it, you know, because they might do something like this. And I'll say right now, especially in a sales related position, they might ask you, you know, what kind of salary would you expect to make in a position like this? And especially in sales, they don't mind if you say something high, if you can show you have the skill set to potentially earn that, you know, if it's commission based or whatever like that. But be prepared to talk about it. So go to salary.com. There's a lot of great salary calculators out there and salary websites that can really give you a nice sense of, all right, what does this type of position pay in this geographic region? So be prepared to talk about it. And then if they do bring it up, then you can broach the subject a little bit more openly. Reiterate your interest in the position. This is really, really important. And actually, it's so important, but very few people do it. I would say probably, I'm guessing at a percentage here, but maybe 20%. You know, so 80% of the people end the interview this way. Here's what they do. The interviewer says, do you have any questions for us? You ask your questions. And then the interview just kind of wraps up and comes to the end. And a lot of times the interviewer will do something like this. They'll say, are there any other questions you have for us? Or, you know, they kind of just leave that politely open up that last moment to give you the stage if you want it. And literally, probably 80% of people just say, no, I can't think of any, thanks so much. And everyone gets up, shakes hands. And in this virtual world, you just kind of wave and say goodbye and thank you. But reiterate your interest. And here's what you do. When they open that door and say, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Say yes. And what you want to do in this little moment here is thank them for the opportunity. So you'd say, you know, thank you so much for the opportunity to interview today. I've really learned a lot about your organization. You know, I saw one person do this at the end of the interview, and it really stood out for me over the years. And they complimented the interviewers on their ability to sell their company to them. You know, because cultural fit is such an important thing on both sides of the street. How you feel you potentially fit into the culture of that potential employer, but how they view you fitting in. So understanding that's important. And this is what the person did. They said, you know, you guys have been so thorough. You've asked so many good questions, and most importantly, given me so much quality information. It's really increased my interest in the position. And thanks for doing that. I thought that was such a smart thing to say, because he complimented the interviewers, also saying how good of a job they did, and he complimented the organization of the company and felt like he was even a better fit because of it. So I thought that added a lot of value. This is also a time at the very end of the interview, if you have an opportunity to say something if you forgot to bring it up earlier in the interview, like if you missed some strength you wanted to share, you can do it now. And you can actually say, I missed the opportunity earlier to let you know, and then you can share it then. So this way you get the opportunity to get it in. And then the final part of the reiterating your interest is tell them you believe you can do the job. This is really, really important. Employers want to hear it. And here's the reason why. They want to hear it because they want to believe that you believe you can do it. And if you say you can do it, they at least believe it, or at least a lot more. So tell them you believe you can do it and say, again, thanks so much. And I really feel confident that, I could handle this position very effectively. The job description you sent me, this interview, all the information I've gotten, again, it's just further increased my interest and my belief that I can be very effective in this position. And I hope I get that opportunity. Thanks so much. And the way you present that with voice, the proper voice inflection is key. I've heard people present it. I was on an interview committee where the guy went like this. You guys can clearly stop interviewing now. I'm the person for the job. It was so over the top cocky that, we couldn't dismiss that guy quick enough, but it's still an important message. So if you say it with the proper voice inflection, it has a lot of powerful impact. So make sure you do that. And coming right to the very end here, another minute or so, send a thank you email. 20 years ago, email was just starting, and I always told people, no, don't send an email, send a letter or, some type of handwritten thank you note. Don't even do that now. Email's totally appropriate. But I will say this with a thank you email. Make sure when you send the actual thank you email, when they open that email, it almost looks like a thank you letter inside the email. So maybe their contact information at the top, dear Mr. or Miss, and then the body of the thank you letter. So make sure it looks professional. But an email is totally appropriate. Make sure you get that out within 24 hours. Whenever your interview is, if it's 1 o'clock on a given day, you want it in their email box by 1 o'clock the next day at the latest. It shows your high level of interest by doing that. On my screen here, I say thanks to Bonnie too. Bonnie was a receptionist that worked at one of the first places I worked at called Central Penn College. And this lady, I'll tell you, she was as nice a person as possible. And she had such impact on interviews because when the interviewer would come in and sit down in that 15-minute prior to the interview, she would relax them, make them feel so comfortable. And it was just so impacting, and it really helped those interviewers feel more relaxed. And it helped us in the interview room because we got the best of what the person was. So what I mean by saying thanks to Bonnie is, if somebody else stands out for you during the process, you're going to send the thank you email to your, the people on the committee. But let's just say in this virtual world, let's say somebody sent you that job description and maybe gave you some other key insightful information and, whatever it was that they really stood out and really helped you. Send them a little thank you email too, saying, thank you so much for helping me before the interview. That really made a difference. That job description was really valuable. Thanks again. It has a lot of impact because even if these people aren't on the actual interview committee, they're going to let their voice be known. And I'll just give this one last example and we'll finish up. To say thanks to Bonnie too is one time we got, and this is 20 plus years ago, we got thank you letters in the mail. And I remember getting them and putting them in the mailboxes of the interview committee. But Bonnie got this little tiny thank you, handwritten thank you note. And I remember taking it out. I was like, Bonnie, I think this guy wrote you a thank you note. She was like, really? So I remember I gave the thank you note to her. She opened it up and it just simply said, dear Bonnie, thank you so much for making me feel so comfortable the other night prior to the interview. It really made a difference and really set the stage. And I just want to thank you so much because I really felt it helped me, and as she was reading this, she was so impacted. She had worked there for like 17 years, never gotten a thank you note. And I remember as I was reading it over her shoulder, I saw this little tear going down her cheek. And I thought, how slick is he? How slick is that guy to send that thank you note? Because look at the impact it had. And it did. Because Bonnie went to every single person on that interview committee and said, look, I know I'm not on the interview committee. I know I have no impact on the decision, but that's a guy I'd hire. I'm just saying. And it had such value because it's this concept of don't leave any stone unturned. If somebody stands out for you, certainly in a live setting, but even in a virtual world like this, where they send you additional information, include them. Say thank you because what they did helped you. Let them know that because they're going to go fight for you too. Okay. And then the final thing we'll wrap up is good references matter. When you actually prepare your references and you're going to bring them to, in a situation like this, you would obviously send them in a virtual world, bringing them to an actual interview. But make sure, and when you choose your references, you're choosing, because think about this, a reference is a phone, in essence, a phone interview with that person about you. It's not a recommendation letter. So the reference is important because you want to pick people, and preferably, that are going to sound good selling you over the phone. So someone, if you have 5 people to choose from, think of the people that are going to really do a good job selling you and sound good selling you with excitement over the phone. Trust me, that translates. That has a lot of value. Sometimes references don't make a lot of difference. I mean, if somebody's a clear number 1 for the position, references are less important. But if there's 2 people are tied for the job and you need all these other determining factors, really strong references that really sell you have a lot of power. And the way they sound over the phone, think about that. And the last thing about references is keep them up to date with all information about the interview process. So what I would say is make sure that as soon as you're done that interview, the first thing I always have done in my past is contact all my references and immediately explain how the interview went. Here's what they focused on. Here's the strengths they were looking for. Here's what they seemed to really like about me. I'll be honest. Here's what I kind of messed up a little bit here. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that and maybe make them feel more at ease if it comes up. Keep them in tune with the process because trust me, they're going to do a much better job selling you. Okay. So that's all I have actually for virtual interview and the interview process itself. So I just want to open it up here for a few minutes and ask if anyone has any questions.
Hey, John, it's Nicole. We already got a question in. I was going to tell everybody to make sure they put their questions in the Q&A. Your first question is, do you know if large amounts of companies use one-way video interview platform when interviewing for internships? That's question 1. And then the second question is, are career services at Penn State helping out with virtual interview practice before the actual one?
Yeah. So the answer to the first question is yes. It's becoming a lot more popular, even with internships. In fact, I had a student, he was an IST student at Penn State Scranton, and he actually applied to a lot of places that were far away. He wanted to try to do a summer internship, out of state. He just preferred to try to do that. So obviously everything was virtual, but a lot of them were the one-way interviews where he had the ability to actually, manipulate his answers and go through it, and for this particular student, it was actually a good thing. He kind of needed that. But yeah, I would say he interviewed probably 7 or 8 times virtually, and I would say 4 or 5 of them were the one-way interviews. And the second part of the answer is yes, career services, definitely helps. We actually do a presentation to students and let them know, let's talk about the virtual interview, the in-person interview. When we do an interview workshop, we talk about how to handle it virtually, some of these other key points, because a lot of this is the same as an in-person interview, but the key components are the technology, the environment, ramping up your enthusiasm in a way that might be mildly uncomfortable for you. Those are the things that really have to stand out in this virtual world.
Okay, great.
Okay. We have another question for you. A lot of questions are coming in. For attire, should you avoid certain colors or prints for the interview?
Yes. I would say, believe it or not, you want to be, definitely professionally dressed, but as muted as possible. And again, remember we talked about kind of your background being just a blank wall, if you can actually achieve that. Be professionally dressed, but like just professional, like when I say muted, I mean, like for guys, charcoal gray or, a navy blue. For guys with a tie, you wouldn't want to, I remember one guy walked into an interview once, he had this really cool Disney tie on with all the Disney characters, and I couldn't take my eye off the thing. I kept seeing Goofy, on the middle of his tie, and it stood out to me, be more subtle, so make sure it's professional and subtle. And then, that's a thing you can check with career services saying, hey, this is what I'm going to wear, take a picture of it and text it to me or whatever. And I can give you a good idea. Yeah, that's going to really translate well. Because again, the focus is you, the person. So let's try not to overdo it. I mean, I think females have a little more flexibility with color, like guys, I tell them, don't wear a black jacket. You look like a mortician maybe, but females look really good in black. And I think that's fine. I think reds can go well, like a red sport jacket or a red blazer, where a guy clearly isn't going to wear a red jacket. So there's some flexibility there, but be muted. Yeah.
Okay, John, the next question is, hello, thanks so much for your time and experience. I want to ask which questions for the company are not asked enough?
Which questions for the company are not asked enough? Trying to understand.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they mean by that either. Which questions for the company?
So just repeat the question one more time.
That you're asking the company. Yeah. Which things should you ask a company when they ask, do you have any further questions?
Okay. Yeah. And actually there's tons of really great questions. So I would say if that person, whoever asked that question, wants to reach out to me via email, I can give you a lot of great questions to ask and show you a lot of good ones. So that'll probably be the easiest way to do it. Just find me on the Penn State Scranton website, Career Services. You'll see my email address, and I'll send you a bunch of really great resources for questions to ask employers.
He said, great, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay. Oh, oops. My little question and answer went away. Okay. We have another one that says, if you are completing a virtual one-way interview and you don't have a specific person to thank, how would you go about following up with the interviewer or interview committee?
That's a great question, and I didn't cover that actually. And so here's the thing: you will know who's going to be reviewing that video. So even though there's not an employer on the other end of that, what they will do is they'll look at that video later. And that's why, in that one-way interview in particular, really focusing and I talk about ramping up your enthusiasm. It's hard to do that when you can't make a connection with somebody on screen. So you really have to pay attention to that. But there will be somebody that will view that later. And typically you're going to be in correspondence with them prior to the interview. So they're going to send you, an email with a link, and they're going to talk to you about time frames on answering questions. So that's going to be the person you're going to send the thank you letter, thank you email back to. So you'll know that person ahead of time.
Okay. In regards to medical/dental school interviews, are they usually structured in the same way?
Yeah, actually, almost exactly. I mean, they can be in person, obviously, online, virtually. I haven't heard of them being one way, though. I would say that if it's a dental med school type of scenario, it's probably not going to be a one-way interview, or at least I haven't seen it yet. So I don't want to say that unequivocally. But yes, otherwise, and the things I talked about today, apply that the same in a medical school interview or dental school interview as an employment interview, because structurally these things make the same difference. How you're going to answer questions effectively, your examples, knowing about the school. The difference will be it's not an employer as much as it is a dental school, and you want to, or a medical school, and you want to know, what their mission statement is and that type of thing, and how you're a fit for the program and that type of thing. So yes, pretty much the same.
Okay, and we have one last question. Says, thank you, John. Very informative and thoughtful tips. Very interesting to speak from your experience as being in previous interview committees. My question to you is it okay to read off a script that you prepare on Google Docs so that you don't forget what to say during the interview? And then also, in addition to that, what are your thoughts on using a professional background on Zoom to hide what's in your home?
Okay. It'd be one of those things I'd have to see what the professional background is, but I would say, again, if it's not distracting and it's more simplistic, that would probably be just fine. Yeah, definitely. And the first part of that answer is a really great question. I would say really try to avoid the notes, because it's the same kind of concept. Just like taking notes, you're going to be distracted by looking at those notes. And believe it or not, as much as notes make you feel better, they can really throw you off, because you'll skip a point that you thought you wanted to read, and it can be distracting for you. Plus, you're going to lose that eye contact. But here's what I will say. Instead of having a major document, what you can do is take sticky notes and stick them on the outside of your computer, obviously not covering the camera, but stick them on the outside of the computer and make little notes on those sticky notes as to jog your memory. I think that's totally fine. And really know where they're at on the screen. If you need to do that, I would say that's the most you want to do, little tiny notes that are going to remind you to get onto a topic. And this is why the practicing ahead of time is so incredibly important and valuable, because obviously you're going to be able to have those notes and you're going to think about, how do I look at them? And if you practice with a family member or you do a Zoom, they'll tell you, no, you looked away a lot. You looked away from the camera a lot at your notes. Be careful of that, or you can do it with me. So I would say, big Google Docs, probably not. A couple notes that'll help frame your mindset about the way you want to talk, that's appropriate.
And then the second piece of that question, if you have time to answer it, is just what do you think about utilizing professional backgrounds?
Yeah, so what I said earlier is, if you're going to use a professional background, make sure it's simplistic. If it's professional, that's not distracting in any way. So I think that would be fine. I think that's fine. But keep in mind, think in terms of, if you were the interviewer on the other side of that, looking at that background, are your eyes going to be looking at that background a lot? So the best answer is just keep it simplistic. Professional and simplistic, I think, is probably fine. Yes.
Hey, John, one quick question for you, our final one for today.
Sure.
How much does the potential employees, person interviewing, social media come into a committee's research/decision?
I lost you for just a brief second there. Repeat that.
Sorry. How much does the potential, the person interviewing, how much does their social media accounts come into the committee's research and decision?
A lot, a lot. So I would say this, as you start to get ready to professionally ensconce yourself into the world of work and the professional environment and interviewing, clean up that Facebook account. Like literally take lots of pictures off that, I think you can keep fun stuff on there, but if there's anything kind of odd or whatever, clean that up in particular. Obviously with a LinkedIn account, it's going to be very professional in general anyway. So yeah, they're going to really look into your LinkedIn account and Facebook account. So really make sure those are cleaned up and have other people look at it too, saying, if you were an employer and you looked at this, would you have any problem with it? And people will give you probably some pretty good input. So yes, really pay attention to those because those will be vetted ahead of time, most likely.
Great. That's all the questions that we have for today.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. Again, this was recorded if you need it in that regard, and certainly feel free to reach out to me via email if you need to talk or set up an appointment to talk further about the topic. Thanks everyone. My virtual handshake.